So our first keynote presenter is Mohamed Abdel-Kader. Mohamed has a personal connection to Clemson, having grown up in Clemson. He went to Daniel, and having graduated in 2001 from Clemson with a bachelor's in political science. He now works as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the International and Foreign Language Education Office at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Post-Secondary Education. Whew. He works to promote the study of foreign language and culture in elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools. His topic is relevant and inspiring for today's symposium, the importance of a global education in the 21st century. It's my pleasure to welcome Mohamed.
Morning, everybody. How are you guys? Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning. It's nice to see so much orange in the audience. You don't see a lot of orange in DC, but I have to say, with this exciting football season behind us, I've been seeing a lot more orange around town and in airports, and that's been pretty fantastic. So I want to start off by just saying thank you. Thank you to Sharon. Thank you to Provost Jones. Thank you to Marty. Thank you to everybody who's organized this event. And I want to say thank you to you guys, to all the students who came out early on a Saturday morning, and thank you to you guys who spent your tuition dollars learning languages, and you spent your tuition dollars going overseas for a learning experience and really incorporating global into your educational experience here at Clemson. I want to thank the administration for committing to international. This is, I think, huge for Clemson. I think it's transformational. I think it's critical for everyone's learning experience. So we'll jump into the presentation. I know I can go on for hours, but I'll spare you that. So I want to jump right in a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I finished up here at Clemson in 01. I was a scrawny little undergrad. I'm still scrawny, as my mom tells me. But I was very involved in student government. I was very involved in the crew team. I was very involved in Model United Nations. And I also had the opportunity to get abroad a few times during the summer, which was fantastic and was eye-opening. So my dad's actually here this morning. And you know, my parents actually immigrated from Egypt in the mid-'70s. I was born in New York and spent a lot of my childhood going back and forth between New York and Cairo. And we spent a little bit of time in Saudi Arabia as a kid, about a year and a half, and it was such an eye-opening experience for me because I very quickly had to realize that, you know, when I was on a playground in New York, I had to tell people about what was going on the other side of the world. And then when I hopped on a plane and went to Cairo and I was playing soccer with my cousins, or we were swimming in a pool, and they would ask me, well, have you met Rambo? Or have you met Sylvester Stallone? No, I hadn't met Sylvester Stallone. I had to explain what life was like in America, and very quickly I realized, again, the importance of being able to communicate across cultures and across borders. And as you can imagine, when we moved to Clemson in 1991, right before the beginning of the Gulf War, I also had a lot of explaining to do and a lot of homework, a lot of studying that I needed to do to get up to speed on world affairs as a 7th grader, and to be able to articulate that in my classrooms up at R.C. Edwards Middle School right up the road. So as you guys go on in your careers, I hope you'll continue to embrace a global perspective and integrate that into your mindset and into your education. So I was appointed into this position to serve in the Obama administration in September of 2014. I oversee a lot of the international programs at the Department of Education. So why is international education important in the 21st century? So let's talk numbers. There's 7 billion people in the world. 75% of those people do not speak English. How many of you guys have been out and about or on campus and heard somebody say, you know what, I don't need to learn another language. Everybody's learning English. How many of you guys have heard that, right? Okay, well, that's simply not true. 75% of the world does not speak English. And those who do often have limited English proficiency. So what does that mean for you as a business person? What does that mean for you as a doctor, as a lawyer working across borders, as an engineer? What does that mean for you? You have to be able to communicate across borders. Let's keep going with some more numbers. There's 320 million people in the United States. 90% of Americans don't speak a second language. So as you guys think about going into the job market, how many of you guys are graduating soon? How many of you guys, well, everybody's hopefully will be graduating within 4 years. It took me a little longer than 4 years to graduate. You guys want to edge up. You want to leg up. Some of you guys are thinking about graduate school. Why? Because it's going to give me an edge up in the job market. Well, look at that. If 90% of American people don't speak a second language, that's a pretty compelling statistic right there to start investing early in your language learning. It sets you apart. It gives you an extra set of tools that a lot of people, frankly, don't have, and they should. And there's an estimate, I always like to say this, just in contrast, there's 400 million English language learners in China. 400 million, and there's 320 million Americans, period. Okay, so there's a huge emphasis in other parts of the world on learning other languages. Let's keep going. So this is a map showing the movement of the avian flu. You guys remember that a couple years ago? It was big and scary. What do you guys see here? It's moving around the world. Okay, so when a global pandemic breaks out, the solution isn't just about immunology. Okay, you have to have a knowledge of how people move around the world, of the languages, of treaties, of borders. You have to understand that dynamic. It's not just a function of straight science. So the world we live in, a disease outbreak in West Africa, something like Ebola or Zika, can be here at our borders within hours, as you understand global logistics. So what happens, again, when doctors don't understand what a patient is saying? What happens when experts and officials need to communicate with each other? Languages are critical, and it's not just English, folks. And what about climate change? How many of you guys think about climate change? How many of you guys are interested in maybe tackling issues like climate change? It's pretty serious. Whether we're at a place like Clemson. Clemson's a great science program, so hopefully we don't have any science deniers in the room. But as you see in the top left, that's a picture from the climate change conference that took place in Paris a couple months back. You see how many flags were represented. So I have a lot of colleagues who were there for that meeting, who worked on that treaty, and I can certainly tell you it wasn't just done in English. If you look at the top right, how can we tackle climate change if we don't understand consumer habits in China or in India or other emerging markets? How are we going to tackle climate change if we don't understand deforestation in places like Brazil or in Indonesia? And how do we understand climate change? How are we going to tackle that if we don't understand energy consumption around the world and in a global context? It's not just about science, folks. It's about this integrated approach, and so much of that is your global competencies, you being globally literate and being able to make connections between everything. So in terms of commerce, how many folks are thinking about a career in business? Yeah. So 1 in 5 American jobs are tied to global trade, and 95% of the world's consumers are outside of U.S. borders. So if you're a business person, you may not want to exclude 95% of the market that's out there. I don't know if that math works in your favor. So something to keep in mind. It's not just enough today. It's not enough for you to just have a finance degree and hop on a flight to Mumbai or Dubai or Cairo or London. Language is an essential part of that. If you're tasked, I'm sure we have some engineering majors. How many engineering majors are in the room? So if you're an engineer and you're going to work for Bechtel or you're going to work for General Electric and you're tasked with building a bridge in Shanghai or in a village outside of Cairo, if you don't speak the language, your job is going to be infinitely more difficult. Each and every day, you probably have to communicate with folks on the job. Hopefully some of you guys have done internships or co-ops at this point in time. Communication is a big part. And even here domestically, sometimes communication can be a barrier. So add in the global context. We have to have these tools. So it's a great investment for you to make in yourself. So what kind of skills are required to work at some of these companies and some of these firms? You even see Fairfax County Public Schools, which is where I live up in D.C. What kind of skills are required to work at these places? And I want to challenge you to think about what kind of skills are required to advance here. So in a lot of my work, we work with a lot of business executives. And they say, you know what? We want to recruit students with these skills. Why? Because as they move up the food chain in a company, the students with these global skills, with the language skills, who've studied a particular part of the world, are able to discern risk a little bit better. Because when you study a part of the world, when you study China, you don't just study China's history. You don't just study the economy, you study everything. You study anthropology, you study culture, you study politics, you study international relations. And in any organization, as you guys move up in your career, whether you are a diplomat, whether you are a military officer, whether you are a CEO, you have to think about risk. You have to think about mitigating risk, and the way you do that, the way you sort through that ambiguity is by having this well-rounded perspective. So this global education is critical for you. Every issue is going to require an understanding of both the global and the local context and the ability to communicate, right? And even here at home. So let's just say you have no plans to hop on a plane, no plans to go overseas, which is fine. That's totally cool. I'm a big evangelist of going overseas, but maybe you're not going to go overseas. Here in our neighborhoods are so much more diverse. You can see some of the statistics up there. In 2006, 43% of students in our schools were minority students. And that was up from 35% a decade earlier. So that number is The demographics are there, folks. Look at the newspapers, you'll see it. So what does that mean for teachers? Who's in their classrooms? Classrooms look so much more diverse. The parents that they're dealing with are so much more diverse. What does that mean for the way we train teachers? What does that mean for our curriculum that we're putting in our schools? What does that mean for how students learn in this new multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual environment? All right, so for those of you in the School of Education, I think I met a few folks earlier, that's something we have to consider. And for healthcare practitioners, for those of you maybe thinking about nursing as a career, I know Clemson's got a great nursing program. Those of you thinking about med school, maybe even medical research. We have patients from all over the world with different cultures and religious traditions. And for you to deliver excellent patient care, you have to be responsive to that. There are different language needs in hospitals. And then we have to think about the global movement of these diseases. When somebody shows up and they've got a bellyache, well, now it's not just, well, were you in Anderson last week and did you go to a Mexican restaurant and have some bad, have some bad tacos? No, we really have to think about the global context. Where were you traveling? Were you in the rainforest last week? Where in Asia were you? Right, we have to think about this, and that's a new calculus for medical practitioners. And even if you want to be an entrepreneur and start a business right down the street here in downtown Clemson, you have to think about where your products are sourced. Perhaps you have to consider the ethics of what's happening on the shop floor. You've got to think about global logistics. How are you going to get the stuff here? So remember when the earthquake hit Japan, a lot of the folks in the electronic industry, their supply chain was disrupted. How are you going to get products in when there's an earthquake and roads are completely gone and they're washed out? You have to think about global logistics. You have to understand the country where your products are coming from. What about competition? What if your company gets swallowed up by a competitor? You have to understand the global dynamics around that. Trade, regulatory issues will all affect the success of your business. If this is your baby and this is what you're investing in, you've got to understand what's happening around you. You've got to understand what they call the non-market. What about global currency? How does that affect your profit margins, financial markets? And frankly, we've got a more diverse workforce. You've got to hire good people, and those good people are probably going to come from all over the world. I just look around the room, and I see so many different kinds of faces than I saw when I was a student. So just imagine what's outside of Clemson. That's got to be part of your calculus as an entrepreneur. So I don't know if you guys have heard of this little dorm room startup. Does this look familiar to anybody? Okay. You've heard of this little company. Let's talk about this little company because it's not so little. So there's 1.6 billion active users. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. Almost 84% of those users are outside of the borders of US and Canada. Now, I don't know if Mark Zuckerberg was thinking about that when he started, but he sure has to be prepared to make sure that his company is sustainable and is responsive to its users. We've got 14 domestic offices, 36 international offices, and the reason I put this up there is just because it's a company that so many of us are familiar with. We use it on a daily basis. It's on our phones. We see their product, gosh, some of you probably every 15, 20 minutes, right? If Facebook was a country, it would be the largest country in the world. The population of China is about 1.3 billion. So it kind of puts that into perspective, right? So what keeps Mark up at night? Mark's got to think about users' languages. He's got to think about censorship issues, not just here in the US, but overseas. He's got to think about holidays. So we all see these little birthday alerts pop up, but sometimes I see holiday alerts pop up on mine. And what kind of holidays does Mark Zuckerberg and his team have to think about? How about paying employees in other countries? We saw all these other data centers and offices around the world, so he's got to think about that. He's got to think about currency. He's got to think about things like refugee issues and other crisis issues. I don't know if you remember a couple of months back there was an earthquake, and on Facebook you could go on and they developed this platform where users, I believe it was in Turkey, could go in and log on and say, I'm safe. They did the same with Paris when the attacks happened in Paris. So a company like Facebook that started out of a dorm room is now starting to be responsive so quickly within years. Facebook started, what, in 03, 04? 12 years later, they're the most populous country in the world, so they have to think about these global issues. They have to think about compliance with local laws, and they have to think about expanding their business, because ultimately Facebook is now a publicly listed business. They want to drive shareholder value, and they're trying to expand into new markets, so they have to think, they have to have a sound emerging market strategy. What about mobile phone penetration? What's the mobile phone penetration look like in Burundi, in Rwanda, in the villages outside of Cairo, in Saudi Arabia, in Singapore? That's all a calculus that they have to have, and they have to have a global perspective to gather that data. So let's talk about opportunity, access, and equity, because I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and it's something very important to us here at the department. You hear it from President Obama, you heard it from Secretary Duncan before he stepped down, and you hear it now from Acting Secretary King. Access and equity is critical. So what happens, and you guys see this in the news all the time, when challenged school districts, how many education majors do we have in here? Quite a couple, okay. What happens when some of these financially challenged school districts cut social studies classes, which may be the only opportunity for our young people in a K-12 school to get exposure to global issues? What happens when budgets are tight and they cut language programs? We see this over and over and over. What implication does that have for access and equity? So when we talk about 1 in 5 global American jobs are tied to global trade, and in some states that's higher, like here in South Carolina where you have companies like Boeing and Microsoft and BMW and Bosch, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of jobs tied to global trade. So what happens to these young people when they don't get their language experience in high school? And some universities have a language requirement when you apply. You have to have 2 years. I believe, is that still the case here at Clemson? We have to have 2 years of a language, I think, to apply. So if that student is coming up through high school and they can't apply to a place like Clemson, maybe they've got fantastic grades, but their school district cut languages, so they can't apply to Clemson. And maybe they end up at a community college. And a lot of community colleges don't have these resources. So they can't take additional language. They can't have additional language training. And they will more than likely from a community college not go abroad because of the resources at that institution, because of the compression of the schedule. They most likely will not go abroad, and they won't get that experience. So what happens when they graduate into that job market where 1 in 5 jobs, at a minimum, is tied to global trade, and they don't have that experience? They're left out of the equation. So for us, we very much think about that, and we think about language learning and a global education as part of the calculus around an equitable learning environment. Let's keep going. So will our students leave college with global readiness and language fluency? That's the question for you guys. What implications does this have for national security? What does it have for economic competitiveness? And what about our neighborhoods? So what can institutions do? And I think Clemson's done a fantastic job in the last few years of investing in some of this stuff. So here's just a few thoughts for some of the administrators and teachers in the room. Commit to a global experience, and I'm so happy to see that Clemson has done this. This has been fantastic. And for you as students, speak up. I was a member of student government, and we were always over in Sykes and making our opinions known. So for those of you guys who are here, the administration's always responsive. Speak up, be a part of this if this is the kind of experience that you want. And I'm glad to see that you're in the room. So for those teachers, integrate global learning and languages into all of your experiences. Sometimes the economics of it are tough. Maybe you have a small language program, but integrate it into everything, from engineering to political science to history to architecture. There's a global dimension to everything that we do. Encourage study abroad. I know a lot of times for students that's tough. It's expensive to get overseas, but hopefully we can get some of the folks on the development team to pay a little attention to study abroad and support the work that Dr. Nagy's doing and Marty's doing with getting folks abroad. That's so critical for you guys. Think about mobilizing networks and resources. There's a lot of alums out there who will hopefully be willing to support and open doors for you. Make it part of the university's culture. Football is such a huge part of Clemson's culture, and I'd love to see Clemson have more of a global flavor on campus. And I feel like the university's heading in that way, and that's fantastic. But it's got to be part of that culture. So integrate partners into the learning process. So I'm always glad to see places like BMW and Michelin recruiting heavily on campus. These are huge multinational corporations, but we got to get more of those companies on campus. And obviously we're at the department always willing to help to do what we can to advance global learning. Integrate things like project-based learning. Those are exciting and applicable for different disciplines. And then integrate the Career Center into it too. The Career Center can't be off on a silo. That's got to be part of the process. So we'd love to see a little bit more of that. So in terms of federal government support, again, this is a little bit more on the grant side of things. All of these different agencies provide different opportunities to help a campus globalize. So everything from the Department of Agriculture, they don't have money that's specific to international, but you can take some of their grants and use it in an international context. Places like the Peace Corps, you can get returned Peace Corps volunteers on campus to be a part of campus life. I remember when I was a student, we had folks from the Intel community who were teaching courses on campus, and it was such a rich and eye-opening experience for me. USAID offers institutional grants. Obviously, we talked about the Department of Ed. The State Department offers quite a bit in terms of Fulbright and other programs. DoD has language programs as well that will continue to support this. So say be aggressive. Don't be afraid to get out there and reach out if you guys need any guidance or assistance. So why does a global education matter, and why does this escalate up here with no wheels? I love this picture for one reason. I think here in America we've done a wonderful job of building this magnificent higher education system. But sometimes I feel like we skimp a little bit on the international. That doesn't do our students right, because we're giving them this fantastic, this beautiful car that's very well engineered, but sometimes we forget about putting the wheels on it that are going to take them forward, because that's the road that's ahead. It's global. That's the reality of the world that we live in. We have to have these tools to be able to go over the bumps and take the curves and go faster and go slower. So let's not forget to put the wheels on the car. So what I often tell folks is stay in touch. My team is always very accessible for the administrators in the room. We're always there for technical assistance as you guys think about applying for grants. We are on Twitter. You can see our handle. It's at GoGlobalEd if you guys are on Twitter. It's not just that we want to tweet and have fun. We use that actually to listen to our grantee community and really understand the value of what's happening with the grants on campus, so that when I'm on the Hill, I can continue to advocate. Email us. Check out some of the YouTube videos we have up. We offer a lot of technical assistance. But that's pretty much it. And I just want to say thank you guys for being here. Thank you for Clemson's commitment to international. Thanks for your leadership, and go Tigers.